August 20th, 1966. Niteroi, Brazil. The bodies of a pair of electronics technicians, 34-year-old Miguel Jose Viana and 32-year-old Manuel Pereira da Cruz, are discovered on top of Vintem Hill, and they are carrying some lead masks and cryptic notes about ingesting capsules. 3 days earlier, the two men had traveled to Niteroi from their homes in Campos dos Goytacazes, over 260 kilometers away, but there is no direct evidence of foul play, and the authorities are unable to determine their cause of death. There are a number of theories about what happened, including speculation that the deaths are connected to UFO sightings from the area, but the lead masks case remains shrouded in mystery. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to this year's final Halloween-themed episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host, Robin Warder, and for the first time ever, our podcast is going to be traveling to the country of Brazil to explore an infamous story that is considered to be one of the strangest mysteries of all time, the lead masks case. As you probably know, it is tradition for The Trail Went Cold to count down to October the 31st by covering unsolved mysteries which either took place on Halloween or have some sort of creepy Halloween slant to them. So for our last episode of the month, I thought it only appropriate that I finally tackle one of our most heavily requested mysteries. The lead masks case involves a pair of electronics technicians named Miguel Jose Viana and Manuel Pereira da Cruz, who ran a TV repair business in Campos dos Goytacazes and seemed like ordinary family men until they made the inexplicable decision to make a 260-kilometer trip to Niteroi and venture to the top of a mountain peak called Vintem Hill, where they would be found dead under very mysterious circumstances 3 days later. There were a number of weird details about the case, as both men had brought along some homemade masks they had constructed which were made out of lead, and they were also carrying some cryptic notes, which implied that they had to be at this spot at a certain time before they ingested some capsules and put their masks on. Miguel and Manuel had developed a big interest in spiritism, a form of spiritualism which is particularly popular in Brazil, and had made remarks about going on a mission and conducting some sort of experiment, but while there was speculation that they might have suffered a fatal overdose, there would be a delay in performing their autopsies, which meant that a proper toxicology analysis never took place, and the authorities were unable to determine their cause of death. But since there were reported UFO sightings in the area around the same time the two men are believed to have died, this has created speculation that something otherworldly happened. Now, given that this mystery took place in Brazil, a lot of the original source material is in Portuguese, so as you can imagine, a lot of the English language sources you'll find out there are cut and paste jobs, which constantly seem to be repeating the same details, so given that this event occurred nearly 60 years ago, you have to wonder how many of these details got lost in the translation and how much misinformation may have spread. However, I have to give a special shout out to a blog located at the website pmig96.wordpress.com, as it features an extensive write-up about this case based on English translations of many of the original Brazilian newspaper articles, and they shed a lot of light on what may have happened here. So to finish our countdown to Halloween, I'm going to try to provide as accurate and factual account of this mystery as possible. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or a review on any of these sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has around 90 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives which are not available on our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the saga of the lead masks case. Our story begins in 1966 in Niteroi, Brazil, a municipality which was the capital of the state of Rio de Janeiro at that time and had a population of just over 500,000. On the afternoon of Saturday, August the 20th, a teenage boy was flying a kite near the top of a mountain peak called Morro do Vintem, whose English translation is Vintem Hill. He was trying to get the kite out of a tree when he wound up coming across the bodies of two men who were lying on the ground in a clearing that was approximately 100 square feet. While it initially appeared that they might be sleeping, the boy noticed that they were emitting a foul odor, so it became apparent that they were deceased. He ventured down Vintem Hill and called the 2nd Department of Police from Niteroi to inform them about his discovery, but since it was getting dark, the weather was not good, and the terrain was difficult, the police elected not to make the trek up the mountain until the following day. They would be joined by a large group of people which included firemen, reporters, and other civilians, and when they finally arrived at the top of Vintem Hill, they indeed came across the bodies of two men which were lying in a clearing next to a 1-foot-tall cement marker pole which was stuck in the ground. They appeared to be in their 30s and were resting on top of some pindova leaves which would have originated from a type of palm tree endemic to Brazil. Both victims were still carrying their identification, which showed that their names were Miguel Jose Viana, age 34, and Manuel Pereira da Cruz, age 32. They were each dressed in suits and waterproof raincoats, but most bizarrely, some eye masks were found next to their bodies which were shaped like sunglasses but had no eye holes. The masks were made out of lead and commonly used by those who worked in electronics as well as radioactive experiments. Miguel was also carrying his wedding ring and wristwatch inside the pockets of both his jacket and pants. In addition, he had a plastic bag containing 157,000 cruzeiros, which was the official currency of Brazil at that time, whereas Manuel had 4,000 cruzeiros in his jacket pocket, and combined, this money would have been the equivalent of around 73 American dollars. Some of the items found at the scene included a nearly empty mineral water bottle, 2 small cups constructed of aluminum foil, a packet containing 2 towels, and a white, folded, unused handkerchief with the initials AMS embroidered on it. Perhaps the most intriguing items were a series of handwritten paper notes, one of which was found inside Miguel's pocket and appeared to have instructions. Since they were written in Portuguese, I've read a number of different English translations of this note, but the most commonly shared one reads, quote, 1630, be at specified place. 1830, ingest capsules after the effect. Protect metals, wait for signal, mask. End quote. There was also a second note which appeared to feature a series of instructions, and here is the most frequently shared English translation. Quote, Sunday, 1 capsule after meal. Monday, 1 capsule in the morning while fasting. Tuesday, 1 capsule after meal. Wednesday, 1 capsule when laying down. End quote. Some of the other handwritten notes featured a cryptic series of letters and numbers and electronic equations, as well as one dirty piece of paper with the Japanese word bonsai written on it. Miguel and Manuel both hailed from the city of Campos dos Goytacazes, which was located in Rio de Janeiro state just over 260 kilometers northeast of Niteroi. In fact, a pair of unused bus tickets from Niteroi to Campos dos Goytacazes were found with their possessions. Miguel and Manuel both worked as electronics technicians and had started a small, home-based TV repair shop together. They were also both married, as Miguel and his wife Elsa, and Manuel and his wife Nelly each had multiple children. As far as anyone could tell, neither man had any financial issues or noticeable problems in their marriages. After the two men's families were notified about what happened, investigators attempted to backtrack their movements to figure out how they wound up in Niteroi. It turned out that Miguel and Manuel had told everyone they were planning to travel to Brazil's largest city, Sao Paulo, to purchase some supplies for work. It was not uncommon for them to leave on business trips, and when word spread that the two men were planning to go to Sao Paulo, some of their friends and family members gave them money to pick up items there on their behalf. In fact, a note would be found with their bodies which read, quote, "By a 500-meter-long thread roll," and it turned out this was a request from Miguel's father. But as far as anyone could tell, neither man had any personal connections to Niteroi or had ever been there before. During the early morning hours of August the 16th, Manuel suddenly woke up his wife Nellie in the middle of the night as he wanted her to count out 2.3 million cruzeiros and put it inside a plastic bag. This would have been the approximate equivalent of 1,045 American dollars, and Manuel told Nellie that he was planning to purchase a used car in Sao Paulo, which they would use for business purposes in order to serve their customers. On the morning of August the 17th, Miguel and Manuel were driven to the bus station by a friend, but instead of boarding a bus to Sao Paulo as planned, they boarded a bus to Niteroi at 9 a.m. They were not carrying any suitcases or a change of clothing, so it appeared that they were planning to return home that same day. Investigators would later learn that the two men had actually boarded another bus to Niteroi 2 days earlier on August the 15th, but after they got off at one of the stops, Manuel started feeling ill, so they decided to take a bus back to Campos dos Goytacazes. It's been reported that Manuel became ill again at the exact same stop during their bus trip on the 17th, but this time around, he and Miguel ultimately decided to complete their trip to Niteroi and arrived there at 2 p.m. Sometime after leaving the bus, Miguel and Manuel stopped by an electronics store on Alberto Vitor Street called Fluscop, which was owned by a business acquaintance named Hernani Teixeira de Carvalho Filho, who had met the two men for the first time during a trip to Campos dos Goytacazes 4 days earlier. They asked to purchase some components for Philips brand television sets, but Hernani said the store did not have them in stock. The two men then told Hernani that they would try to find these components in Sao Paulo and asked if he would like to accompany them there, but Hernani declined before they left. At 2:45 p.m., Miguel and Manuel paid a visit to Casa Brasilia, a haberdashery located on Coronel Gomez Machado Street, where they purchased a pair of waterproof nylon raincoats, which cost a total of 18,000 cruzeiros. By this point, it was raining outside, but the two men appeared to be in a hurry, and they did not even put their new raincoats on before they left. At around 3:15 p.m., they arrived at Bar e Merceria Sal Jorge on Marques do Parana Street, where they purchased a bottle of mineral water. According to the employee who sold it to them, both men seemed to be agitated, and Miguel was frequently checking his wristwatch. After the mineral water was purchased, the two men asked for a receipt, as they said they intended to bring the empty bottle back for a refund of 200 cruzeiros, the equivalent of about 9 American cents. Indeed, this receipt would still be in their possession when they were found dead. After Miguel and Manuel left the bar, they were last seen heading in the direction of Andrade Pinto Street, which ended at the base of Vintem Hill. You might recall that one of the notes found with their bodies mentioned being at a quote-unquote specified place at 4:30. Since walking up Vintem Hill to the spot where they were found would have taken them about an hour and 10 minutes, the timeline did add up for them wanting to arrive there by 4:30. The note also mentioned ingesting capsules at 6:30, and a second note contained instructions for taking capsules from Sunday until Wednesday. The last entry mentioned taking one capsule while lying down, and since August the 17th happened to be a Wednesday, this could have explained why Miguel and Manuel lied down in that particular spot. Since the bottle of mineral water was nearly empty, and there was a pair of aluminum makeshift cups at the scene, this seemed to explain how these capsules could have been ingested. It turned out that on the morning of Thursday, August the 18th, another teenage boy had been hunting on Vintem Hill and came across the two men's bodies, though he wasn't sure at the time if they were just sleeping. He went to the nearby home of an off-duty policeman to tell him about this discovery, but the policeman did not take the boy seriously and just ignored him. As a result, an official police investigation would not be performed until another boy reported the discovery of the bodies 2 days later, and they were not collected and removed from Vintem Hill until Sunday, August the 21st, at which point they had started to decompose. The bodies were taken to the coroner's office, but it turned out they were quite busy at the time, as a prominent detective had been murdered in an unrelated crime that same day, and his case became the top priority. One of the coroner's assistants performed the preparation for the autopsies of Miguel and Manuel, which involved removing their internal organs. Unfortunately, the organs were left sitting on a shelf for 3 days, and by the time they were examined, they had greatly deteriorated and were subsequently thrown out. When autopsies were finally performed on the two men, the delay had caused too much decomposition, so a proper toxicological analysis could not be performed. While there were signs of blood on their mouths and noses, as well as some of the pindoba leaves they were lying on, there were no noticeable injuries or signs of foul play, and it was now impossible to test for the presence of toxic substances in their systems to determine what may have been in the capsules they supposedly ingested. As a result, the cause of death for both men could not be officially determined. Police sought the assistance of the Engineering Institute of the Army, who examined the 2 lead masks, but they concluded that the masks did not contain any radioactive material and played no role in the men's deaths. Miguel's brother Herval traveled to Niteroi to claim the 2 bodies, and they would be buried at Caju Cemetery in Campos dos Goytacazes on August the 24th. Since they were unable to determine how Miguel and Manuel died, the police delved into their backgrounds in an attempt to figure out why they made the lengthy trip to Niteroi and climbed Vintem Hill in the first place. It turned out that both men had developed a major interest in spiritism and made a number of cryptic remarks to suggest that they were hoping to do something important. Spiritism is a form of spiritualism which was developed in France in 1857 by writer Allan Kardec, who defined it as, quote-unquote, the doctrine founded on the existence, manifestations, and teachings of spirits. Spiritism wound up achieving its greatest level of popularity in Brazil, and Miguel told people that since it provided a way for spirits to materialize, he felt that science could convert living matter to pure energy, allowing one to contact beings from another dimension. At one point, Miguel said to his father, quote, I am certain that Earth is not the only inhabited planet. Many other planets are as well. I'm currently studying the subject, and I am increasingly convinced that the possibilities of man reaching another inhabited world are much greater and easier than one might imagine. End quote. A few days before he made his trip to Niteroi, Miguel informed his sister Isabel that he was going to perform an important experiment, stating, quote, very soon I will fulfill a very important mission, but it's a secret I can't reveal to anyone. End quote. Isabel also claimed that during her last days of interaction with her brother, he seemed quiet and often had a worried expression on his face. According to Miguel's brother-in-law, Arialdo Santos Viana, he had only spoken to Miguel 2 or 3 times over the course of a decade, stating, quote, he was so strange that when he went to my mother's house to pick up my sister, he would stand outside staring at the sky, and when he was invited in, he would refuse without speaking, just shaking his head, end quote. Manuel's widow Nellie reported that the day before he left on his trip to Niteroi, she had seen her husband constructing a mask inside his workshop out of material from a lead pipe, and when she asked what it was for, he replied that it would be used in a great experiment. Indeed, when police searched the workshop, they found some additional lead masks, as well as cut-out pieces of lead that matched the holes over the noses on the masks they had been found wearing. The workshop also contained a book on scientific spiritism titled Life on Planet Mars, and some passages which reference quote-unquote intense luminosity have been highlighted. This led to speculation that the 2 men may have constructed these masks to shield their eyes from a bright flash of light they believed they were going to witness. On August the 12th, 5 days before Manuel and Miguel traveled to Niteroi, a friend and neighbor of theirs named Fernando Jose claimed that he walked into their workshop and saw the 2 men hammering on a lead pipe. Manuel then told Fernando, quote, we are creating something that will prevent the end of the world in 1968, when that great cyclone will devastate a large part of our planet, end quote. The 2 men's families told police that their interest in spiritism had been heavily influenced by a friend of theirs named Elcio Correa Gomez, who worked as a radio technician and had once been hired by Miguel to be his apprentice at his repair shop. It's been reported that at the outset, Miguel was a lot more interested in the subject than Manuel, but Elcio eventually helped both of them become heavily obsessed. Miguel had lifelong struggles with asthma, and Manuel suffered from chronic abdominal pain, but Elcio had apparently convinced them that spiritism would help remedy their problems. The men's families did not like or trust Elcio very much, as they said he would show up at their homes at odd hours in order to discuss spiritual matters and often conducted seances with them. Nellie even claimed that she had once witnessed a serious confrontation between Manuel and Elcio in which Elcio threatened to kill him. Well, on May the 12th, 2 months before the lead masks incident, there would be a very strange incident on Atafona Beach in São João da Barra, a municipality located about 35 kilometers northeast of Campos dos Goytacazes. At around 9 p.m. that evening, there was a large explosion which created a blinding flash and caused damage to nearby buildings, and was so loud that the noise could be heard from several kilometers away. When police investigated the beach, they found a crater which measured 14 inches wide and 10 inches deep and smelled like sulfur. The incident sparked hysteria that the explosion was caused by a flying saucer which had crashed into the ocean, and 2 days earlier, the Brazilian Navy's monitoring service had reportedly intercepted some strange transmissions in the area between station prefixes CKJ21, CKJ22, and CKJ23, even though there were no amateur radio transmitting stations registered under these prefixes. However, Elcio had alleged that the explosion was the result of an experiment which was performed by Miguel and Manuel. Elcio claimed that the two men invited him to accompany them to Atafona Beach that night, though he gave contradictory accounts, initially saying that they traveled there in Miguel's car before he changed his story and stated that they made the trip in his own car because Miguel's vehicle was broken. It's unclear what exactly this experiment was supposed to be, but Elcio insisted that he was merely a witness and not an active participant. But a different account would be provided by a man named Valdir Cardoso, who worked at Miguel and Manuel's repair shop and sometimes participated in their spiritual sessions. Valdir also claimed that he was present at Atafona Beach for the explosion, but alleged that he, Miguel, and Manuel were all invited there by Elcio to witness something, quote-unquote, supernatural, though he wouldn't disclose any specific details. Valdir said that when they arrived, Elcio went down to the beach alone while the rest of them waited by the car. When Elcio returned 10 minutes later, he was running, and Valdir said that he noticed a large red-purple light coming down towards the water. Elcio told the other 3 men that they needed to leave immediately because something bad was about to happen, and after they drove away, Valdir remembered detecting a strong smell of sulfur, though he maintained that he did not hear any explosion. Valdir also claimed that Elcio had once borrowed 250,000 cruzeiros, the equivalent of around 113 American dollars, from Miguel, but he never paid it back after telling Miguel that a quote-unquote mermaid from the river took my money. Indeed, Miguel had told members of his family that Elcio threw the money into a river called the Paraíba do Sol as a quote-unquote gift to the sirens to protect both of us from death. The cause of the explosion at Atafona Beach was never conclusively determined, but sometime in June, a few weeks after the incident, Elcio, Manuel, and Miguel worked together to perform another experiment in the backyard of Manuel's home, which led to some sort of mechanical device exploding in the garden. According to Elcio, they had built this device in hopes of using it to contact Mars because they believed it had a superior civilization, but it accidentally wound up exploding. It turned out that when Miguel and Manuel were driven to the bus station in Campos dos Goytacazes by a friend on the morning of August the 17th, they briefly met up with Elcio there before boarding their bus to Niteroi, though he would always maintain that he still believed they were traveling to Sao Paulo. On August the 27th, Elcio was taken into custody by police and transported to Niteroi, where he was detained for questioning. Elcio confirmed that he, Miguel, and Manuel were all members of a group of what he described as quote-unquote scientific spiritualists. He said the group was comprised of electronic specialists who attempted to use their expertise in the field to contact extraterrestrials or spirits. Elcio also claimed that they attempted to make contact by taking psychedelic drugs such as acid, LSD-20, or mescaline, And of course, this led to speculation that Miguel and Manuel may have ingested their mysterious capsules on Vintem Hill because they believed they would experience some sort of otherworldly event. While Elcio maintained that he had no idea why the two men made their trip to Niteroi, he was able to shed a bit of light on some of the odd clues found at the scene. For instance, I previously made mention of a cryptic note which contained a series of letters and numbers, including EY88, ELC82, and 12AU7. Well, Elcio confirmed that these were nothing more than codes used to identify electronic valves and analog TV sets, and he had actually given them these codes so they could purchase these valves, and this piece of information turned out to be true. Elcio also seemed to have an airtight alibi placing him in Campos dos Goytacazes during the time period that Miguel and Manuel's deaths were believed to have taken place, as he provided a receipt to show that he had purchased parts for his car that afternoon, and some of his neighbors would report having seen him working on his car in front of his house. Since there was no evidence of Elcio having committed any crime, he was released from police custody without charge. In spite of this, the victim's loved ones still felt there was evidence to suggest that they had met with someone in Niteroi, and this individual could have played a role in their deaths. As you might recall, when Miguel and Manuel first arrived in Niteroi, they stopped by the Fluskop electronics store, but the route from the bus station to the store would have required them to pass by a spiritism center called the Society for Studies and Research in Spiritism. They later stopped by the Casa Brasilia haberdashery to purchase raincoats before they traveled to Bar Merceria São Jorge, but this route would have allowed them to pass by another spiritism center called the Rio de Janeiro Spiritism Federation. It's never been established if the two men visited either of these centers, but it's been reported that they appeared calm at Fluskop, but seemed more agitated at Casa Brasilia and Bar Merceria São Jorge, which could suggest that they had met up with someone. Shortly after the two men's deaths made the news, a man named Raulino de Matos came forward to police, and he told them a second-hand story which had supposedly been shared with him by an unidentified woman. De Matos claimed that at around 5 p.m. on August the 17th, the woman had seen a jeep containing 5 men park on Andrade Pinto Street near the base of Vintem Hill before they all climbed out and began a trek up the mountain on one of the paths. Given the timeline, De Matos believed that 2 of the 5 men may have been Miguel and Manuel, but as far as I can tell, this woman who shared the story was never tracked down to corroborate it, so it's never been confirmed if Miguel and Manuel ventured up Vintem Hill with anyone else. However, even though it was established that the cryptic note found at the scene containing the instructions about the capsules was in Miguel's handwriting, his family believed it contained phrases that were not part of his ordinary vocabulary, such as, quote-unquote, ingest capsules. For this reason, they wondered if an outside party may have dictated the note to Miguel for him to write down. One of the biggest unanswered questions involved the 2.3 million cruzeros that Manuel's wife Nelly had put inside a plastic bag for him, as he was supposedly planning to use this to purchase a used car in Sao Paulo. A plastic bag was found in Miguel's pocket containing 157,000 cruzeros, but while Manuel was carrying 4,000 cruzeros, and the two men had spent 18,000 cruzeros to purchase their raincoats, there was at least 2.1 million cruzeros which were never found or accounted for. Of course, this led to speculation that both men were the victims of an elaborate scam and were lured to Vintem Hill, but no evidence could be found to support this theory. Investigators were also contacted by a man named Jose de Souza Arias, who alleged that 4 years earlier, another man had died on another large hilltop in Niteroi under very similar circumstances. According to Arias, the victim was a French television technician named Hermes, who was found dead on top of Morro do Cruzeiro with a lead mask lying next to his body. However, as far as I can tell, the police do not have any records of this incident, and it was not reported on by any of the local news outlets until after Miguel and Manuel's deaths, so I have no idea if it actually happened. Investigators also looked at the possibility that Miguel and Manuel may have been involved in espionage or smuggling, since regulations made it difficult to obtain foreign electronics equipment in Brazil at that time. Once again, these angles came up empty, but one of the most prominent theories was that their deaths were somehow connected to UFO activity. After the discovery of the bodies made the news, a Niteroi woman named Griselda Barbosa Coutinho de Souza came forward and reported that around 7 p.m. on the evening of August 17th, she was driving down Sao Boaventura Street with her 3 children when they saw what appeared to be a flying object in the sky hovering over Vintem Hill. She described it as being an orange-colored oval-shaped object with what appeared to be a ring of fire around its edges, which fired off blue rays of lights and was moving up and down for 3 straight minutes. When Griselda returned home, she reported the sighting to her husband, but even though he drove towards Vintem Hill, the object was gone by this point. Griselda said that she was reluctant to share this story until she heard about the discovery of Miguel and Manuel's bodies, and since they would have been at the top of Vintem Hill during the approximate time period of her sighting, she wondered if there might be a connection. Since Griselda and her family were considered to be very respected, upstanding citizens who seemed to be unlikely candidates to fabricate a UFO sighting, her account inspired some other Niteroi residents to come forward to confirm that they also saw a flying object hovering above Vintem Hill on the evening of August the 17th. Elcio Correa Gomez would claim that Miguel and Manuel had developed a habit of traveling to remote places in order to perform rituals in which they would ingest self-made drugs or capsules in order to communicate with the spirit world. Upon hearing about the UFO sighting over Vintem Hill, Elcio theorized that Miguel and Manuel had gone there to ingest some capsules in hopes that their bodies would be transported and reintegrated inside an alien spaceship for a period of time before they were returned to Earth. Elcio alleged that when the 2 men's bodies were found by police, they were not actually dead at the time, but instead experiencing a deep cataleptic sleep which stopped their hearts and preserved their nervous systems. However, when the police removed them from the scene, this prevented Miguel and Manuel from being reintegrated back into their bodies. Well, even though I doubt the lead investigator on the case, Adoyam Ferrara, believed that particular theory, he did suspect that Miguel and Manuel had suffered an accidental death after ingesting some drugs as part of an experiment, which wound up costing them their lives. In October, Ferrara officially announced that the police investigation would be closed and issued a report containing this passage, quote, "Considering the investigations carried out in relation to the case, we have come to the conclusion that deaths of both were caused by the search for experiments to prove the existence of the soul, or by telepathic communications, or any other experiment, among the many covered by parapsychology, through the search for a state of semi or total unconsciousness caused by poisoning with substances, capsules of chemical composition not identified in the examination, and whose vehicle for ingestion was the mineral water purchased moments before in a nearby bar." End quote. While this temporarily closed the case, in March of 1967, Edmo Lutterbach, a district attorney with the Ministry of Justice, announced that he was unsatisfied with Ferrara's conclusion and ordered the police to reopen the case. Lutterbach was perturbed by a number of odd discrepancies, as a closer examination of the original autopsy report showed that the name of a specialist named Sebastião Feliz had been erased and replaced with the name of another specialist named Walmor Gianni. As a closer examination of the original autopsy report showed that the name of a specialist named Sebastião Feliz had been erased and replaced with the name of another specialist named Walmor Gianni, as Feliz had apparently been so dissatisfied with the report's conclusions that he asked his name be removed from it. In August, Miguel and Manuel's bodies would be exhumed from Caju Cemetery, and Feliz was assigned the task of performing a new autopsy and toxicological analysis. Samples of bones, tissue, and scalp were also removed and sent to the Institute of Atomic Energy in Sao Paulo for radioactive testing in hopes they might turn up some toxic substances. But unfortunately, the results of this new testing were inconclusive, and Feliz concluded that since both men's bodies had been given an excess amount of formaldehyde during the embalming process, he was unable to perform a toxicological analysis. So in the end, this new investigation failed to shed any more light on the circumstances of the 2 men's deaths. But the following year, in September of 1968, speculation of UFO involvement only increased when a photographer named Ari Pereira managed to snap a picture of what appeared to be a flying object hovering over Vintem Hill. According to Pereira, it remained there for a few minutes before it flew away and emitted such an intense silver light that he had to use a yellow filter on his camera. After the photo was published in the newspapers, other witnesses came forward who also reported seeing the object. Well, in February of 1969, it was announced that a suspect named Hamilton Dizani had confessed to his involvement in Miguel and Manuel's murders. Dizani was a career criminal who was serving a 50-year sentence at the Carandiru Penitentiary in Sao Paulo for murder, robbery, and car theft. He claimed that back in 1966, he was on the run as a wanted fugitive and wound up crossing paths with 3 other criminals whom he referred to as Wilson the German, Acasio, and Spaniard. The gang offered Dizani a job, and he wound up accompanying them to one of the Spiritism centers in Niteroi, where the owner, a priestess named Madame Helena, introduced them to Miguel and Manuel. However, it turned out that Madame Helena had orchestrated a setup and hired the gang to rob and murder the 2 victims. According to Dizani, they all drove to the base of Vintem Hill, and while he waited in the car, Wilson, Acasio, and Spaniard accompanied Miguel and Manuel to the top of the mountain. The 3 gang members later returned alone and told Dizani that they had forced their 2 victims to take poison at gunpoint and arranged for the lead masks and cryptic notes to be found at the scene in order to confuse investigators. And were supposed to meet up again at a designated place in order to split up the money from the robbery, but Dizani claimed he never went there because he feared the gang would double-cross him and kill him too. Dizani also alleged that Miguel and Manuel had installed communication equipment on ships that were used by the gang for smuggling purposes, which is why Madame Helena felt they needed to be silenced. Well, after Dizani was transported to Niteroi and interrogated by police, they noticed that his story was filled with contradictions and ultimately reached the conclusion he had fabricated the whole thing. No evidence was found to indicate that Wilson the German, or Acasio, or Spaniard, or Madame Helena actually existed, as they suspected that Dizani was trying to make some sort of deal in order to get transferred to another prison in Niteroi, which would have been easier for him to escape from. Dizani wound up getting shipped back to the Carandiru Penitentiary and was later sued for giving false testimony. A few months after Dizani made his confession, police announced that they had uncovered another potential suspect, a fugitive who went under the names Professor Ramayama and Count Ramayama. This man had escaped from prison at least twice and was wanted for many crimes, but what was particularly interesting is that his real name was Alexandra Montero Salvanito. You might recall that a handkerchief with the initials AMS had been found with Miguel and Manuel's bodies, and as far as their families could tell, neither man owned such a handkerchief or knew anyone with these initials, which is why Alexandra Montero Salvanito seemed like a potentially compelling suspect. Unfortunately, the police did not provide any further context about why they believed this guy was connected to the case, and no further mention of him was made. The story soon faded from the spotlight, but in 1989, Miguel's widow Elsa gave an interview in which she discussed how difficult it was raising 3 children on her own, as she claimed that both she and Manuel's widow, Nellie, had spent the past 2 decades being hounded by police and reporters who seemed convinced that they held the key to the mystery, even though they both maintained they knew nothing. The following year, the case would be featured on an episode of the Brazilian true crime TV show Linha Direta, who subsequently produced a second episode about the case, which aired in 2004. During the second episode, it was revealed that it was not possible for police to reopen the investigation again because the original files could not be located and had likely been destroyed due to inactivity. So after nearly 60 years, it is still unclear what caused the deaths of Miguel Jose Viana and Manuel Pereira da Cruz, and the lead masks case continues to remain shrouded in mystery. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So whenever someone puts together a basic list of the weirdest unsolved mysteries of all time, it's common practice to see the lead mask case listed on there alongside such classics as the Mary Celeste and the Dyatlov Pass incident. As you can imagine, ever since the inception of the Trail Went Cold, I've received numerous requests to cover this case. Like I mentioned in the intro, one of my biggest obstacles to putting together an episode is that many of the original source documents were written in Portuguese, a language I do not speak, and a lot of the English language sources out there seem to be cut and paste jobs which all share the same talking points, so I couldn't be certain of how accurate they really were. I've already covered a number of older mysteries on this podcast which took place several decades ago, and during my research, I would often discover that some of the creepiest details were greatly exaggerated or outright false, but had been repeated so many times in the numerous retellings that they were now accepted as fact. This is why it's always important to try and track down the original contemporary sources from before the misinformation started spreading in order to attempt to distinguish which details were fact and which were fiction. I previously made mention of an excellent blog about this case at the website pmig96.wordpress.com, where the owner managed to translate a lot of the Portuguese language Brazilian newspapers that originally reported on this story, and I actually wound up learning some new details which I didn't know before. I was also surprised to discover that in the weeks following the discovery of Miguel Jose Viana and Manuel Pereira da Cruz's bodies, the North American media also reported on their deaths, and you can actually find a number of English language articles about this at newspapers.com. It seems like the mainstream media coverage pretty much came to an end after the 1960s, but this story is still heavily discussed in Brazil, and I just mentioned that it was featured on the popular Brazilian true crime TV show Linha Direta in both 1990 and 2004. Both these episodes are available for viewing on YouTube, but since they were originally broadcast in Portuguese without subtitles, I had to watch them with YouTube's English captions turned on. As you probably know, YouTube's captions are never 100% accurate, so there were some amusingly bad translations, but thankfully, the aforementioned WordPress site did a very good job at clarifying a lot of details. Surprisingly, as weird as the whole lead mask saga is, it does not appear that all that many fabricated details have been spread during the numerous retellings of the story, though as you can imagine, many sources put heavy emphasis on the possibility that the two men's deaths were caused by UFOs. Since forensics have advanced so much these past few decades, I'm sure that if Miguel and Manuel were found dead under these circumstances today, it would be a lot easier to figure out what happened to them. The big reason this has remained a mystery for so long is because the two men's organs were not properly preserved, and there was a major delay with performing their autopsies, and by that point, their bodies had decomposed so much that it was impossible to perform a toxicology analysis. If they had been able to determine that Miguel and Manuel had ingested poison, then the how of this case would no longer be such a huge mystery, though I'm sure there would still be a bunch of unanswered questions about the why. Now, since this took place in Brazil in 1966, I think it's safe to say that there wouldn't have been a deep and widespread understanding of mental health issues, which could have shed some insight into why Miguel and Manuel chose to do what they did. From today's perspective, it almost appears that the two men may have been sucked into a cult and possibly tricked into taking their own lives in some sort of suicide pact, but at the time, we were still many years away from Jonestown and Heaven's Gate, so the general public wouldn't have been aware of such a concept. I think the main reason this whole thing shook a lot of people up at the time was because Miguel and Manuel seemed like ordinary, hardworking men with wives and children who appeared to be unlikely candidates to become embroiled in a situation like this. Yes, it is clear that they had developed a devout interest in Spiritism and made a number of cryptic remarks about performing some sort of important mission, but I don't think anyone envisioned that they would make a 260-kilometer trip to another city and wind up dead on top of a mountain. As you probably know, I've always had a particular fascination for cases in which people go missing or wind up dead under mysterious circumstances after traveling to a faraway location which they had no reason to be at. This is clearly another example of this because Miguel and Manuel flat out lied to their friends and families by telling them they were leaving on a trip to Sao Paulo, but instead decided to travel to Niteroi, a place they seemed to have no personal connection to and had possibly never visited before. While their motives for traveling to Niteroi are still unclear, we at least have a pretty good outline of their movements after they arrived there, as they stopped at a couple of locations to purchase some items before they headed up Vintem Hill. On the basis of one of the notes they were carrying, it appears they believed they needed to be at the top of the mountain by 4:30 p.m., but one of the big unanswered questions is why they chose this specific destination. Well, before we start talking any further about Miguel and Manuel's movements, we need to discuss their friend, Elcio Correa Gomez, who worked as an apprentice to Miguel at the repair shop and was apparently a major influence on their lives, who helped them develop their passion for spiritism. It sounds like the two men's families did not particularly like Elcio, and even if he was not personally involved in their deaths, they felt he was at least partially responsible for what happened to him. During the early stages of the investigation, police pretty much considered Elcio to be their primary suspect, as he was taken into custody and transported to Niteroi to be detained for questioning, but it was established that he seemed to have a very strong alibi, placing him in Campos dos Goytacazes during the time period when Miguel and Manuel are believed to have died. Still, there was always suspicion that Elcio knew more than he was letting on, and even if he was not present for the two men's deaths, he could have manipulated them into making their ill-fated trip to Niteroi as part of some sort of elaborate con job he was involved in. Indeed, even though Miguel and Manuel were driven to the bus station in Campos dos Goytacazes by another friend that morning, Elcio still met them there and spoke to them about something before they boarded the bus, so in spite of what Elcio told police, he may have been the only one who was aware they were not actually traveling to Sao Paulo and knew the real reasons for why they were going to Niteroi. All that being said, Miguel's brother Herval was interviewed on the 2004 episode of Linha Direta, and while it sounds like he did not consider Elcio to be a particularly great person, Herval said he no longer believed that Elcio had anything to do with the two men's deaths. It's possible that even if Elcio was manipulating them, he may not have envisioned that things would escalate to the point where they'd wind up dead. I guess the main reason to be suspicious of Elcio is because of the mysterious explosion which took place on Atafona Beach in May of 1966, 3 months before the lead masks incident, as there seemed to be contradictory accounts of Elcio's involvement. Elcio claimed that he was not an active participant, and Miguel and Manuel only invited him to the beach to witness them perform some sort of experiment. But the story provided by another friend, Valdir Cardoso, is that Elcio invited him, Miguel, and Manuel to Atafona and had them all wait by the car while Elcio went down to the beach to do something, and when he returned, he convinced them to flee the area before the explosion took place. Well, if Valdir's version of events is the correct one, I can see why Elcio would feel compelled to lie, because this explosion wound up creating a major disturbance and causing some property damage, and it even made the news. It's unclear what exactly they were doing there, but we know that something happened since a small crater was found on the beach, which smelled like sulfur. And a couple weeks later, another incident like this occurred when the group was performing an experiment in Manuel's backyard when a device they had constructed in order to supposedly contact Mars wound up exploding. I would not be surprised if they were attempting a similar thing when the explosion took place on Atafona Beach, and these incidents have only helped to fuel the speculation that Miguel and Manuel's eventual deaths were somehow connected to UFOs. Well, I can definitely believe that the two men traveled to Niteroi and ventured to the top of Vintem Hill because they genuinely believed they were going to make contact with some sort of alien race. I have no idea what kind of devices they constructed before they exploded, but we know they obviously didn't bring any devices along with them on their lengthy bus trip because they were not seen carrying any suitcases or large objects. But since they went to the trouble of constructing a pair of lead masks shaped like sunglasses, it seems apparent that they believed they were going to witness a bright flash of light and needed to protect themselves, as the last line on one of their cryptic notes was, quote, "Protect metals, wait for signal, mask," end quote. Since the masks were found next to their bodies rather than on their faces, it appeared that they died before they had the chance to put them on. The Protect Metals line would also explain why Miguel went to the trouble of removing his wristwatch and wedding ring and placing them inside his pockets. Of course, the main reason the whole UFO angle wound up gaining so much mileage was because of the eyewitness account provided by Gracinda Barbosa Coutinho de Souza, who claimed she saw a flying object hovering over Vintem Hill at 7 p.m. Since the aforementioned note mentioned ingesting capsules at 6:30 before waiting for a signal and masking, this is only furthered speculation that Miguel and Manuel were waiting for this flying object to arrive and it somehow caused their deaths. Or, if you believe Elsio's explanation, the two men were left in a permanent cataleptic sleep because the police removed Miguel and Manuel from the scene and prevented them from being reintegrated back into their bodies. Now, on the one hand, Gracinda and her family were considered to be very respectable citizens, and she was not believed to be the type of person who would fabricate a story like this, so there is good reason to think she's being genuinely sincere about what she saw. But on the other hand, she did not come forward and report her sighting of the UFO until days after Manuel and Miguel's bodies were found and the story made the news. Gracinda claimed that she initially remained silent because she feared she would be mocked if she reported having seen a flying saucer, which is perfectly understandable, but I think her story would have had greater power if she had reported seeing a UFO over Vintem Hill before the two men's bodies were discovered and no one even knew they were dead up there. After Gracinda's story went public, some other local residents came forward to report that they also saw a flying object that night, and they told a similar story about how they initially feared they would be ridiculed, but felt more comfortable sharing their account after a well-respected woman like Gracinda went on the record. But once again, their accounts would have had a lot more power if they came out before the discovery of the bodies. I do think it's possible that these witnesses saw something unusual in the sky that night, but did not initially find it to be all that significant until this very weird story about two dead men with lead masks being found on top of Vintem Hill became such a huge story, and the power of suggestion convinced all these people that they had seen an alien spacecraft. I know that a picture of a flying object which appeared to be hovering over Vintem Hill was taken by a photographer named Ari Pereira 2 years later in 1968. But I've only seen a black and white version of this photo, which was published in the newspaper, and it looks like nothing more than a blurry bright light above some clouds, so I can't make much out of it. However, what I find particularly interesting is that this story wound up capturing the attention of noted French ufologist Jacques Vallée, who paid a visit to the top of Vintem Hill in 1980 and talked about the lead mask case in the prologue to his book, Confrontation, A Scientist's Search for Alien Contact. In case you haven't heard of him, Jacques Vallée is such a prominent figure in the field of UFO research that he actually served as the inspiration for Francois Truffaut's character, Claude Lacombe, in Steven Spielberg's iconic 1977 science fiction classic, Close Encounters of the Third Time. The one detail which I find odd is Vallée's claims that when he arrived at the clearing where Miguel and Manuel's bodies were found, the ground was nothing but barren soil, as the grass had apparently failed to grow back in the 14 years since this incident occurred. If Vallée's account is true, I really don't have a logical explanation for this, and it could suggest that something otherworldly took place there. But I will add the disclaimer that even though one of the Lynn Hadretta episodes presented a reenactment of this event, I have not seen any actual photographs of the clearing with the missing grass, so take the account with a grain of salt. Another interesting angle to this whole saga is that another television technician named Hermes was supposedly found dead on top of an entirely different mountain, Morro do Cruzeiro, in 1962, with a lead mask near his body. If true, this would be one hell of a coincidence and suggest that something really odd was going on in Niteroi during that time period, but unfortunately, the only real information we have is a second-hand account from a witness who told the police about it. So unless some official documentation or news articles can be uncovered which confirm that this 1962 incident actually happened, I'll once again have to take this with a huge grain of salt. So now let's try to come up with a logical explanation for what happened to these two men, which doesn't involve aliens. I find it highly unlikely that Miguel and Manuel's deaths were intentional suicides, as we know they were carrying unused return bus tickets from Niteroi to Campos dos Goytacazes. And when they purchased the bottle of mineral water, they asked for a receipt and said they were planning to bring the empty bottle back for a refund of what would have been the whopping equivalent of 9 American cents. These don't seem to be the actions of people who are planning to take their own lives, so I think that even if their deaths were caused by ingesting something fatal, they were still expecting to survive. Now, when Miguel and Manuel arrived in Niteroi, they stopped by an electronics store called Fluscop and chatted with the owner, Hernani Teixeira de Carvalho Filho. They asked to purchase some components for Philips brand television sets, which Hernani found unusual, since he believed they should have already known that parts like this were not ordinarily available in Niteroi. I find it intriguing that Miguel and Manuel said they would try to find these components in Sao Paulo and asked Hernani if he would like to join them. This is yet another detail which would seem to point away from them planning suicide, as there's no reason to invite Hernani along on a future trip if they know they're going to be dead soon. It's also worth reiterating that they were found carrying a note containing codes for the electronic valves and TV sets, so maybe they were planning to pick up these components at some point. Even though they had return tickets to Campos dos Goytacazes, part of me wonders if Miguel and Manuel were still hoping to travel to Sao Paulo if everything on Vintem Hill had gone according to plan. While it is possible to take a round-trip bus ride from Campos dos Goytacazes to Niteroi during the course of one day, Sao Paulo is located nearly 700 kilometers away from Niteroi, and it would have taken them nearly 10 hours to travel there. This indicates to me that their families were expecting them to be gone overnight, even though they didn't bring along any suitcases or changes of clothing. We also know that the two men said they were planning to purchase some work supplies in Sao Paulo and accepted money from friends in order to buy stuff from there on their behalf, and Manuel also asked his wife to put 2.3 million cruzeiros inside a plastic bag, which he said would be used to purchase a car for their business. So what was their story going to be if they didn't return home with a car or any of these items? This is why I have to wonder if they were still planning to travel to Sao Paulo after concluding whatever business they had in Niteroi. I'm also not sure what to make of the fact that both men supposedly hopped on a bus to Niteroi 2 days earlier on August the 15th, but then decided to return back home after Manuel became ill. This would have taken place before Manuel asked his wife to put the money inside the bag, and I believe the lead masks were not even constructed by this point, so what would the two men have done if they had completed their trip to Niteroi that day? Anyway, after their visit to Fluscop, Miguel and Manuel stopped at Casa Brasilia to pick up their raincoats, and then went to Bar e Merceria São Jorge to pick up a bottle of mineral water. There is some question about whether they stopped at any other destinations to meet with someone, as there were 2 separate spiritism centers on their route. By the time they arrived at Casa Brasilia and Bar e Merceria São Jorge, the men were described as seeming more agitated and impatient, and Miguel was frequently checking his watch at the bar. Given that it was around 3:15 p.m. at that point, I can see them being in a rush if they had fallen behind schedule and believed they needed to be at the top of Vintem Hill by 4:30, as it would have taken them over an hour to walk that distance. Another odd detail is that Miguel's family always maintained that he left his wristwatch behind at home, so does this mean that the watch he was carrying did not actually belong to him? If he met up with someone else, perhaps they gave him the watch so that he could keep track of time for a planned rendezvous. Now, we don't have any other official sightings of Manuel and Miguel meeting up with people in Niteroi, other than the account from Rolino de Matos, who claimed that a woman told him that around 5 p.m., she saw a jeep containing 5 men parked near the base of Vintem Hill before they all headed up the mountain on a path, and it's possible that 2 of them could have been Miguel and Manuel. Obviously, since this account was shared secondhand by de Matos, and I do not believe this woman was ever tracked down, it's easy to doubt the veracity of this story. However, the note that the 2 men were carrying only contained the words, quote, 1630, be at specified place. While it's easy to assume that the specified place was the top of Vintem Hill, how do we know that Miguel and Manuel weren't supposed to be somewhere else at 4:30 and then venture up the mountain at a later time? After all, the instructions on the note were to ingest capsules at 6:30, So if they needed to be at the top of the mountain at 4:30, what would they have been doing there for the next 2 hours? Just standing around in the pouring rain? I also find it interesting how the details of this sighting seem to correspond with details from Hamilton Desani's confession 3 years later, as he claimed that Miguel and Manuel were escorted up Vintem Hill by 3 men who wound up murdering them, though I don't find Desani's story to be credible. It's also intriguing that there was a cement marker pole planted in the ground at the spot where the bodies were found, and if the 2 men had been planning to meet someone there, perhaps this marker was intended to be used as a reference point. Since there were no signs of foul play or noticeable violence on the 2 men's bodies, one of the most prominent theories is that they were the victims of an elaborate con job, as someone could have lured them to this location and tricked them into ingesting something which cost them their lives by promising that this would allow them the opportunity to make contact with an alien race or something. They had a note on them containing instructions for how to consume some capsules from Sunday until Wednesday, and August the 17th happened to be a Wednesday. The last step also specifically stated, quote, 1 capsule when lying down, and, well, Miguel and Manuel were found lying down. Since a proper toxicology analysis was never performed, we have no idea what these capsules could have been, but obviously, if they had already been taking them for 3 days prior to this event, they must not have been fatal. As far as I can tell, neither man's family ever confirmed having seen them ingesting any capsules on Sunday, Monday, or Tuesday, but if they did, that obviously means they acquired them before they traveled to Niteroi. And for all we know, perhaps someone provided them with specially poisoned capsules or something after they arrived in Niteroi for them to ingest on Vintem Hill. It seems apparent that their only reason for purchasing mineral water was to use it to ingest the capsules, as the bottle was nearly empty when it was found, and there were also 2 makeshift cups constructed out of aluminum foil found at the scene. The note also specifically read, quote, ingest capsules after the effect, but I have no idea what this so-called effect could have been. We may never know what was in those capsules, but one detective who worked the case pushed forward the theory that they could have contained curare, a powerful toxin often used by indigenous people in Central and South America for the purposes of hunting, as it can cause muscle paralysis and death by asphyxiation if it makes direct contact with the bloodstream. But the hole in that theory is that curare does not become active if you ingest it orally, which Miguel and Manuel appear to have done with whatever incapacitated them. It can only become fatal if it enters the bloodstream after contaminating a wound, which neither man appeared to have. While there are logical explanations for some of the items found at the scene, we still don't know the purpose of some of the others, such as the dirty note with the Japanese word bonsai written on it. The police never actually went public with this detail until June of 1969, when they revealed that there was a cult of Japanese origin in Niteroi who were known to often use the word bonsai during their meetings. But even though some members of this cult were apparently interrogated, this lead never went anywhere. It was also only a few months after this when police announced that a man named Alexandra Montero Selva Neto was being looked at as a potential suspect and could possibly have been the source of the handkerchief found at the scene with the initials AMS on it. All we know is that this guy apparently lived near Vintem Hill at one point and would have guests at his home to participate in experiments involving parapsychology, but once again, this lead did not seem to go anywhere. Even if Miguel and Manuel were not deliberately murdered, I can understand why their loved ones would have believed that other people were complicit in their deaths, or at the very least, knew more than they were letting on. For instance, even though it was established that the cryptic notes were likely in Miguel's handwriting, his family believed that they contained phrases that were not part of his ordinary everyday vocabulary, such as, quote-unquote, ingest capsules. This is why they've suspected that someone else may have dictated the instructions in the note to Miguel while he wrote them down. You might recall that the 2 bodies were found resting on top of some pindoba leaves, which were likely removed from some nearby palm trees, but the problem is that you need a knife or some sort of cutting tool in order to chop them off. Since nothing like that was found at the scene, this suggests that someone else chopped off the leaves and placed them there, and then took their cutting tool with them when they left. Obviously, the most troubling unanswered question is the 2.3 million cruzeros that Miguel asked his wife to put inside a bag for him, as he was found carrying a bag containing only 157,000 cruzeros. And since Manuel was carrying 4,000 cruzeros and 18,000 cruzeros were spent to purchase the raincoats, what happened to the remaining 2.1 million cruzeros? Of course, the story provided by Hamilton Desani in 1969 is that 3 criminals robbed and murdered Miguel and Manuel by forcing them to drink poison and only left behind the lead mask and cryptic notes in order to fool investigators. I'm sure Desani's account is completely false, as it sounds like he fabricated the story because he was hoping to be transported to Niteroi in order to orchestrate a prison escape, and it's awfully convenient that he would just happen to be waiting in the car while his 3 so-called accomplices took the 2 victims up into the mountain and killed him. Whenever people make false confessions, it's very common for them to try to distance themselves from having participated in the actual crime. I certainly don't rule out the possibility that somebody set up Miguel and Manuel in order to rob them, but I'm not sure why they wouldn't take all the money in addition to leaving other valuables, such as Miguel's wristwatch and wedding ring, behind. So could this mean they willingly turned most of their money over to someone before they wound up at the top of Vintem Hill? I suppose another possibility is that since their bodies were lying out in the open for about 4 days, some opportunistic person could have stumbled upon them before the police arrived and took advantage of the situation by stealing most of the money they had on them. You might recall that a teenage boy actually noticed the bodies on August the 18th and went to the home of a nearby policeman to inform him about what happened, but the policeman pretty much just ignored him. Well, a potential theory pushed forward on one of the Linta Doretta episodes is that the policeman could have traveled to the scene on his own, noticed that the victims had a bag of money, and then decided to steal it without telling anyone. Anything's possible, I guess, but I think that if they were really planning to buy a used car, they would have just traveled straight to Sao Paulo, so I think that there must have been something in Niteroi that they were intending to use that money for. Of course, if there was no one else involved in Miguel and Manuel's deaths, and they made this trip to Vintem Hill completely of their own accord, it's possible they were both suffering from some sort of undiagnosed mental illness and had delusions of grandeur. Remember, Manuel once made a statement that they were going to do something to prevent the end of the world in 1968 because he felt a cyclone was going to devastate the planet, and well, that obviously didn't happen. This could be a case where both men ended their own lives by ingesting something that killed them, yet in their own minds, they didn't consider it to be a suicide because they believed they were achieving a greater good, which would allow them to do something like contact alien visitors from another world. If this is what happened, then I can understand why it would be difficult for Miguel and Manuel's loved ones to accept this, because if they acted completely on their own, then it will be impossible to ever learn the full truth. I think that if the original investigation had been handled correctly and a proper toxicological analysis was performed at the time, this might not be as much of a mystery, and the case would possibly be long forgotten about today. But as it is, there are so many odd details and unanswered questions surrounding this case that it will probably be destined to remain one of the most baffling unsolved mysteries of all time. However, if by some small chance you happen to have any information about the lead masks case, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 7 years, our Patreon page has released around 90 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about the bizarre and baffling 2001 murder of real estate agent Mike Emmert, which is technically considered to be solved, but still has a bunch of unanswered questions. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss the 2001 disappearance and murder of Margie Dabney, an elderly woman who somehow went missing from an airport. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have nearly 80 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Alexandra O., Tanisha D., Tanya C., and Kimberly S. Thank you all so much for your support. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. And as you probably noticed, we've been spending the last few weeks playing a special Halloween-themed version of the Trail Went Cold theme. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week and a happy Halloween, and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.